that's the case in those. Now, when you have a child that's preschool age, chances are they can be with their parents even, or they might have walked just a little bit away from their parents, but it does not exclude the chance that their parents might be right there with them. In that case, I guess they're just really going to have to be like the parent was hit and the child was grabbed. Now, that wasn't reported to us, and we don't have any reason to try to believe that the parent was attacked and maybe blackmailed to not say anything further. That's really not what I'm thinking or trying to imply. But the chance that maybe Summer walked away and further away than we had once thought, or even thought that she would, such as walking down her driveway, walking way out into the woods. What I want to talk about is some of the things that haven't been we haven't been able to rule out completely, such as the witness in the red truck. We haven't been able to rule this out to find out for sure they didn't see anything whatsoever. That's something that we want to rule out because we can't stop looking into that until we can rule it out. Then, in a recent interview with the young man that was with Candace on the day that Summer had gone missing, he mentions a phone call, and that brings up some interesting points. In the phone call, he mentions that there's talk about the people on the property touching the kids, watching the kids. Made a comment about the parents even told them they were going to have to call the police, and finally they left. But that in particular, and then they spoke about some Billy, which was, I don't know, a friend of Grandma's, or I think the young man said has the hots for Grandma or something like that. But any things like this are interesting to me. Also, the camper that was trying to camp in a tent on property adjacent from the wells, property that was for sale. And I think it was said that possibly this person, the camper, had been arrested. I can't find anything to say for sure about that, but I want to talk about the importance of these random people. And that is because whenever I've looked deeply into searching after what are we looking for here, it came to note for me to be of particular importance when we're looking at this investigation that these are so rare. They are so rare and they're so unique. And I also feel like that tends to be a reason why I've left it as a possibility in this particular case, because this particular case has brought nothing but rare and unique incidents. I mean, I refer to this case as a unicorn. It's just kind of one of a kind like it so far. These type cases where you have an abduction, they represent less than 1/2% of all of the fatalities involving children. Now, I don't want to yet classify Summer as a fatality. The information that I have pulled for the investigation does refer to that particular type of an abduction and crime. So I will have that come across my information a lot. However, it's not every single time, and I want to leave it open for the possibility that maybe we can recover Summer alive. And that's, I know, what everybody wishes for. And regardless of where anyone is on the spectrum of if she's alive, if she's not, and why you think so, I think it's pretty natural for any of us to waver back and forth. We look at the stats, it's pretty easy to discern that, okay, there's a large possibility and a large chance that something could have happened to her. And it's easy to kind of get to that point. But it's also likely, if you continue to look and understand, that that's not every single case. And I think especially realizing how very rare this particular case is, I think it's important to realize that she very well may still be alive. And another important aspect to leave, because chances of her surviving do go down more and more and more as time goes on. So it's important that if we can bring her in alive, that we do this, and we do it as soon as we possibly can. I found it interesting in my notes of things in the investigation that it speaks particularly to the investigators about the rarity of this particular crime, that most investigators in all of their career of 40 years, they're going to probably not even come across one child abduction case like the type of an abduction where it's a stranger or a just rare, they barely kind of knew the target, that is so rare that they may only kind of come across that never. And it's hardly that you can find an investigator that may have had one case just like this. It's so important that the Department of Justice put information out and research about. They compiled 1,000 cases where they could find this particular kind of crime and put together extensive research on it just for investigators to go off of, because this is not something they're going to come across every single day. But people and centers like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Polyclass Foundation, John Walsh, and other organizations put together for reasons of child safety, recovery, and prevention of crimes, they have all been able to put together some pretty interesting research and methods of what to do in case of an investigation. One thing that I found interesting was how we were able to see the TBI doing the grid search as far as the neighbors and talking to the neighbors. I found it interesting that they talked about other agencies coming in behind, following up with the neighbors, because of the importance of sometimes they have been able to find that a child was being held indeed in a location where an investigator had already been to their door, given them a flyer, asked questions, and then moved on. And then it was the second sweep where they realized that they indeed were there, or they had been there. It's also interesting to note that over 50% of these child abductions, if something happens with that child, 50% of the time they're going to have that child hidden right there on site. And 2/3 of the time, they are not going to move any further out than 1/2 mile. So that was interesting. It was also interesting that most likely they would use their residence or their home, their resident type location, as the place that they would go to. So I thought that was interesting. When looking into information about the abductor themselves, I found it pretty interesting that they fall. The information specifically says you're not going to necessarily be looking for your standard, typical dirty old man. in that they're not necessarily old, and they don't they look more like the guy next door than they do the homeless guy or guy under the bridge. Not saying that those, couldn't be traits of the person, but more than likely they're gonna kind of be your normal looking kind of guy, in that when it comes to race, more the grand majority, like 80 to 95% or more, are going to fall in the white male. So there are going to be some females, but it's so small of a percentage that it does put you looking at a white and a male. Middle-aged, anywhere, I'm seeing 27 being an average, but then on another large group, the Center for the Department of Justice had put out that 27 was an average age, but when I looked at further and more updated information, 36 was what they considered average age for this particular profile. Okay, I looked into the type of work that they might likely be doing. Now, 50% of this type is going to be unemployed. And I want to go ahead and say, too, it goes along with some of the traits that the Behavioral Analysis Unit has put together for this type of person. They are going to be what you would consider odd or strange or on the fray of society. They are not married. They don't have a partner or a girlfriend, but they don't necessarily live alone. Normally, they live with someone. This is going to be your typical, living in the basement, or they live with their family, or they live with a group of people. They typically do live with a group of people, even though they are strange and awkward and kind of a loner type of person. When it comes to their living arrangements, they typically live with a group of people. So they're not going to be found living alone, although it's important to note that who they live with is not going to be a close partner. They don't have typically your girlfriend or wife, I should say, long-term partner. Okay, in their work, they are half of the time they're employed. Their work isn't going to be steady, but here are their jobs. Most commonly, a huge percent, actually the number one most likely job that they are going to have is they're going to be a construction worker of some type. Something in the construction worker industry. Number one top likely employer. I think that also Don Wells mentioned that he had fired somebody the day before this all went down, so I'm hopeful that the investigation has looked through all of the associates with any of the construction work going on with Don Wells. Second in line is going to be a truck driver. Truck drivers were number 2 in the top 5 employers or type of careers held by this type of abductors. You've got auto workers and service workers and food industries as the bottom 3. 34% of the time, they are going to live with parents. They can live alone 17% of the time, with a partner of some sort 16% of the time, with spouse or children 12% of the time, and with other 7% of the time. They're going to be transient in nature, meaning they're going to change residence often. And in fact, in the last 5 years, they will probably have at least one time in the last 5 years changed where they've lived at. They found 79% or more had moved in the last 5 years. 43% changed 3 or more times in the last 5 years, and 21% had moved more than 5 times in the last 5 years. And I found that interesting because I feel like that felt true to be with the person in the tent, the person that came up to stay in the shed when they were in a fight with their partner or spouse. Again, they're described to be the fray or the fray marginal, deviant, they're non-conforming. Only 4% could be described as a model citizen, versus the opposite of their victims. The victims tend to be, their targets who they abduct, tend to be the person next door, the just your normal, something that just doesn't really raise a whole lot of flags. What I mean is they're not high risk. They're not typically high risk. They're typically going to be from a suburb or from their home. They're not homeless. They're not street people. They're not presenting themselves to be at a high risk level. 40. These are words that were found in associations to people to describe them as being strange 40% of the time. To be associated with drug abuse 32% of the time. Alcohol abuse was 32% of the time. Drug abuse was 27% of the time. Friendly to children 21% of the time. Reclusive 20% of the time. Sexually promiscuous 19% of the time. And transient or semi-transient 16% of the time. That's not what they were. This is how you would describe them to be. The importance of that is because of how often it is and how likely it is for a person to present a false self to the world and to their friends around them. So it's how they're going to maybe be described. That's how many of the percentages. That's the number of how they're described. It doesn't necessarily reflect where they truly fall, obviously, because transient, to be described as transient, fell at 16%, and we know that actually a transient type of personality is going to be a huge factor in the type of abductor that's going to fall into a particular crime where it's a non-family abduction. Okay, what's also interesting is this applies to Summer Wells because of her being female. If a child is male, they are more likely to be harmed by somebody that knows them, like their mother or their step-parents, their biological parents or step-parents. If they are harmed by them, 9 times out of 10, it's male over female. I would like to find out what that reason is, but I'm just going by stats, what's told in the criminal Department of Justice criminal investigations for abduction. And when it's female, it's 9 times out of 10 going to be that they are the targets of this type of abduction. I thought that was really interesting. If it is male, they're usually much younger, like 7 and under. And for that, I can imagine it's because they're not going to fight as much. They're more vulnerable. Okay. It's important to remember that the investigation began as a missing child that was taken, walked away, or disappeared. A stranger was looked for, but small cases led to family members or immediate family. It usually comes back to being a stranger or someone that kind of barely knows the family, but they are normally, in a large amount of times, they have been looked at by the investigation at least one time, and a lot